Before we can talk about trade and specialization, let's go ahead and see how the PPF can actually shift. And the PPF can shift in two directions. It can shift to the right or it can shift to the left, and they mean two different things for the economy. First, let's go ahead and see what happens if the PPF shifts to the right. And if the PPF shifts to the right, this is going to indicate some type of economic growth happening within the economy, and it can occur for two particular reasons. Number one, expanding resources. So we find more in terms of our factors of production or resource, so more land, more labor, more physical capital, or we have improving technology. So we hit our final factor of production there. So something happens with our technology that sort of improves it. So what happens if we have increasing resources, expanding resources, or improving technologies? That's going to indicate economic growth, and that's going to shift our PPF outwards or over to the right, so away from the origin. So with PPF 0 that we see right here, this once again just tells us that this is the amount of goods and services of both of these goods that we can produce. But suppose that our economy finds more labor. Suppose that they find more land or they have improving technologies. Our PPF is going to shift outwards to PPF 1 here. An outward shift of the PPF does mean that we do have economic growth. And why do we like to see economic growth? Well, it tells us that the economy can now be producing more of these goods in combination with one another. So PPF 1, we notice that on this line right here, we have extended the range of the maximum amount of combination of both of these goods that the country can be producing, and that's going to be good for any country. So we always want to see an outward shift of our PPF outwards because that does indicate some type of economic growth. But however, we don't necessarily have to have a very nice and symmetric type of PPF shift as such, and we can also shift it in the opposite direction as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at these two particular cases. So let's go ahead and see what happens if the PPF shift is not symmetric. So PPF shifts do not have to be symmetric. Do not have to be symmetric. So on the slide that you just saw there, it was a very nice, neat, and symmetric graph. But in this instance, we don't necessarily have to have that in this instance. So let's go ahead and build up our own PPF. So here we have our own PPF. And we're going to be drawing a lot of graphs in this particular class. So suppose that we start off with PPF 0 right here. So PPF 0, our original production possibilities frontier. And suppose that we have capital goods on the vertical axis. And then we have consumption goods on the horizontal axis. Consumption goods. And just for notation right here, consumption goods are just goods that require a little bit more labor to make, and capital goods are goods that require a little bit more physical capital to make. So that's what we sort of mean in economics between capital and consumption goods. Let's suppose that we introduce a shock with a positive technological shock. So suppose that we have a positive tech shock. So something happens within the economy that makes our technology a little bit more improved. And let's suppose that this positive tech shock affects capital more than labor. That affects capital more than labor. So in this instance, what do you think is going to happen to our PPF? It's going to shift our PPF outwards. That much should be seen right here because of a positive tech shock. But which one of these goods is that going to impact more? It's going to impact our capital goods more because that requires more capital to make. So, for example, our PPF could be something along the lines like that. So that's a kind of ugly PPF, but that sort of works. We do notice that with our new PPF right here, PPF 1, it affects the capital goods a lot more than it did with our consumption goods. You could have probably drew this PPF outwards where it doesn't actually impact the consumption goods as much at all, but that's perfectly fine as well. So in this instance, we do notice that it's not a very symmetric shift because our tech shock that we introduce is affecting one of these goods, the production of one of these goods more than the other. But it still indicates some type of economic growth happening within the economy. Finally, let's go ahead and take a look at a negative shock. So negative shocks to the PPF, So we don't always have a positive shock to the PPF, which indicates economic growth. We can go ahead and have some type of negative shock that pushes our PPF inwards, telling us that no longer are we able to produce the maximum amount of goods and services that we did before. The key word that we want to focus in on with these negative shocks is that these are events that cause the factors of production, our resources, the factors of production to be permanently lost. So to be permanently lost. So the key operating word here is going to be permanently lost, or something's going to be preventing us from using up all of our resources. So here, anytime we permanently lose one of our factors of production, we're just going to indicate that with a negative shock to our PPF. So what does this look like in terms of that? Here we have PPF1, and then when we have a negative shock, we're going to be shifting our PPF inward. So our initial PPF is 0 right here, PPF 0. We have a lot of goods, we have a lot of services being produced. But with a negative shock, we shift our PPF inwards, telling us that, hey, we are no longer able to produce the same amount of both of these goods at the same time. So what do you think would be an example of a negative shock to the PPF? It can be losing out on the resources. It could be some type of deteriorating technology. We can also say, what about war? What happens in war? A lot of people lose their lives, so we're not able to, we don't have the same amount of labor as before. We can say natural disasters. So suppose there's an earthquake, volcano blowing, global warming, hurricane, doesn't really matter. It's going to we're going to permanently lose a fraction of our resources when these happen. We can also say some type of plague happening, so people start dying as well. Some type of nuclear apocalypse, zombie apocalypse, any type of apocalypse that you can think of. This is going to be denoted as our negative shock to the PPF. So this is exactly going to be our negative shock. So negative shocks. And these are all examples of that. Suppose that we go ahead and get a little bit into a little bit more of a recession. So how do you think a recession is going to be impacting our PPF? And that's going to be our next question right here. So answer this question. How will a recession affect a country's PPF? Give you guys a little bit of time to think about this. So when you take a look at your answer choices right here, you're probably going to hone in on letter choice A and letter choice C. The country's PPF will shift inwards, and the country will produce at a point below an unchanged PPF. Using the process of elimination, B, D, and E really don't make a lot of sense for us. So the country's PPF will shift outwards. We know that, hey, a recession is bad for the country, so that's not going to be economic growth, so we can cross that off. We do know that a recession is probably going, we do know that a recession is probably going to impact the PPF, so that letter choice E doesn't make sense. And the country producing at a point above an unchanged PPF, remember, we can never reach that point unless we have some type of improving resources or improving technology, and that's not what we have right here. So what's the difference between letter choice A and letter choice C in this instance? So here, with the country's PPF shifting inwards, that denotes some type of negative economic growth, and we've permanently lost one of our factors of production. But with a recession, have we permanently lost land, labor, physical capital, or technology? And we haven't in this instance. So with the recession, it just tells us that we are no longer being efficient anymore. We still have the same amount of labor, we still have the same amount of population, but these people haven't died off yet. We're just not being able to put them to work at full employment. Remember that the PPF tells us that we are being production efficient. There is no slack within the economy. So the best answer for this particular question right here is the country is going to be producing at a point below an unchanged PPF. So what exactly does that look like for us? We can draw this out for you. So here we can say that a recession is we are at point A initially. So that just tells us that, hey, everything is hunky-dory within the economy. We are production efficient. But when the recession happens, it tells us that, hey, some people lose their jobs. We are not being production efficient anymore. So therefore, we are at an attainable region, but we are being inefficient within the economy. So as we move from point A over to point B, this is going to be more indicative of a recession. So an event where we haven't permanently lost one of our factors of production, it's only going to be on a temporary basis. So you do want to be a little bit careful between the temporary loss versus the permanently lost resources in this instance, because with a permanent loss, we actually shift the entire PPF, but with a temporary loss, we don't shift the PPF at all. We just go from a point on the PPF to somewhere inside of it, meaning that we're being inefficient in this case. So this does do it in terms of our full discussion of the PPF, and now we'll go ahead and turn our attention to trade and specialization and use the opportunity cost to derive why specialization is going to be good for us in the next video.